Follow in his footsteps and get water myself. Mark, did you want to put your back on this chair? Or do you want to sit up there? But do you want to sit up? Maybe in about 20 years, probably. Probably. Seriously? I remember you guys stayed at my house. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Fiction. Hi, my name is Melanie McNair. I'm the Senior Director of Public Programming here. How many of you are visiting us for the first time tonight? Well, you're all very welcome. I've told a few of you already, but I'll just give you a very quick. Oh, could you hang on a second? We're a little short staffed tonight, so I'm playing tech director too, and the music should stop any second. There it goes. Okay, so the Center for Fiction used to be the Mercantile Library, which was founded in 1820 in New York City by a bunch of merchants who wanted to give people a way to better themselves and have a better life before there was a public library system. And we're still a membership library. It's all focused on fiction now. We're the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. And we've got this beautiful home for readers and writers here. Just a couple of housekeeping announcements. We are going to do a Q&A tonight. And even though we could probably all hear each other, we've got people who are watching on a live stream. So if you have a question, raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you so they can hear you as well. And if you're on the live stream, hello and welcome. You can type your question in the chat at any time and I will read it to our guests. When the event is over, the books are in the bookstore, which you can get to from that door. And then just come back in here and Tom will personalize it if you want. He did pre-sign them all. All right, well now let me introduce our guest. Tom Piazza is celebrated both as a novelist and a writer on American music. His 12 books include the novels The Auburn Conference and City of Refuge, the short story collection Blues and Trouble, the post-Katrina manifesto Why New Orleans Matters, and the essay collection This Devil Sent the Rain, Music and Writing in Desperate America. He was a principal writer for the innovative New Orleans-based HBO drama series Treme and the winner of a Grammy Award for his album notes to the Martin Scorsese Presents the Blues, A Musical Journey. He is joining us in New York from New Orleans tonight. And to talk with him tonight, David Gates is here. He's the author of the novels Jernigan and Preston Falls and two story collections, The Wonders of the Invisible World and A Hand Reached Down to Guide Me. His fiction has appeared in such publications as The New Yorker, The Paris Review, Granta, Esquire, Tin House, GQ, and the Best American Short Stories. He's published nonfiction in The New Yorker, The New York Times Book Review, and The New York Times Magazine, and the Late and Lamented Book Forum, Rolling Stone, the Virginia Quarterly Review, the Oxford American, and the Journal of Country Music, as well as Newsweek, where he was a longtime senior writer. Please welcome them both to the stage.
He's Tom.
Thank you. Good to see you.
Gee, we're doing this.
Here we are. We are, in fact,
I
doing
know
it.
just the first thing I wanted to ask you. And am I live here? Oh, okay. In fact, I tipped Tom off to this backstage. The end of your more recent novel, A Free State, ends up in the town of Auburn, New York, and I assume that this cover image is Main Street of Auburn, New York. Number one, have you ever been in Auburn, New York? And number two, what's the deal with Auburn, New York? And and also with that whole area, which is called the Burnt Over District. I mean, it's just such an interesting, strange place.
Was and is still. Yes, I've been in Auburn, New York. So my preceding novel, A Free State, takes place in 1855, and the central character is an escaped enslaved African American from Virginia, who's also a brilliant musician who goes to Philadelphia to play music. And I could go on about it, but that's the basic thing that's going on in the book. And the final chapter in the book, he is being pursued during the course of the narrative by a slave hunter, a professional slave hunter, of whom there were many at that time. And the final chapter is a kind of break with the chapters that precede it, and it takes place in Auburn at the house of William Seward, at that time senator, but also would-be Secretary of State under Abraham Lincoln. And Seward was an important person in the Underground Railroad at that time. So our escapee, Henry, who's a very talented banjo player and singer and performer, stays there for a night or two on his way to Canada. Anyway, I had a teaching gig before that book came out. I had a teaching gig at Hobart William Smith Colleges up in the Finger Lakes area, up in Geneva, New York. And my much better half, Mary, who's here with me tonight, will always go and find the historical marker. If there's a historical marker nearby, even if it's hidden in a thicket of trees, 2 miles off the road, she'll kind of go, it's over there somewhere, probably. So anyway, we'll do that. She has a great thirst for that kind of stuff. So we went to these different places, and one of the places we went was Seward's house, which is a museum now. But by the way, it's maybe a mile from Harriet Tubman's compound, which Seward helped Tubman finance and buy. And you can go to both places now. Anyway, at the Seward house, in the basement, is a room with a big stone fireplace, very rustic feeling, and that's where the escapees used to wait before they got the green light to proceed to go to Canada. And that made a big impression on me. Just looking at that place was just, my God. I mean, it was a good place to hide out for a night or two, but, it was redolent of what that time meant and what that place meant. So...
and we might note that Harriet Tubman is a character in this new book.
Say again?
We might note that Harriet Tubman is a character in this new book.
She's an assistant character. Yeah, but she's there. That's right. And so is Henry, the banjo player. He makes a return visit in this book. But anyway, so when I started to have the idea for having a kind of, and I don't know how many of you, how much you know about this book or know in advance about the book, I invented a writers' conference that takes place in 1883 because I had the idea in 2018 on the eve of the midterm elections when all the usual stuff was hitting the fan in very, very heavy measure. And I was wondering what, like everybody else, I'm sure everybody else in this room and everybody else in the country was wondering what the hell was going on in the country in 2018, as opposed to now. Of course, we're still wondering. And I thought, who talks today with the combination of, lyrical presence in the prose and an imaginative presence, and also with the moral topspin, moral engagement.
It's me, Tom.
Well, there's you, but I know you, and I can't put you in the. So anyway, and I had this idea. So but where was I going to set it? And Auburn just kind of came to hand. I thought, well, it would be natural to set it there. For one thing, it's got Seward, it had Tubman, and also that district that what David mentioned was this so-called burned over district, which is basically a run of cities, small cities that graze the tops of the Finger Lakes, basically between like Buffalo and Albany. I could read a little section about it, I suppose. I describe it. Would that make sense? Or would that go too far?
You just said it.
I just said it, okay. Somebody wants me to read.
We'll get to the entertaining part of this soon.
Anyway, no, you know what? I am going to read just a bit of it, just so that you can know what you're talking about, since you thought it was important enough to ask me about it. I will do that. This is the first chapter. It's chapter 5. It's just a couple paragraphs, but just so you know where this takes place. In the deep recesses of upstate New York, the winters are empty and absolute as the desert. The wind, the cold, the buried earth, black branches and chimneys etched sharp against an endless bone white. When spring arrives and then the summer, the richness of the orchards, the vineyards, the lakes and trees and fauna, the high spirits and paddle boats and carriages can make you forget the winter and its desolation. And one can believe oneself in paradise until autumn, in its treacherous glory, erodes that certainty, and by November closes the lid on the world of appearances, driving one indoors, even underground, once again. It is a territory of extremes. Auburn sits at the geographical center of a region referred to as the burned-over district, which runs roughly parallel to the route of the Erie Canal, grazing the upper tips of the Finger Lakes between Albany and Buffalo. In the early decades of the 19th century, pioneers from New England made their way west through this territory, founding small farms and observing uneasy treaties with the native Iroquois and Mohawk. They brought their religion with them, along with its contentious denominations, Presbyterian, Methodist, Congregational, Baptist, Universalist, and missionaries followed them on horseback, distributing pamphlets and Bibles. But, like the desert, the land engendered prophecy, and in the isolation of the scattered early settlements, sects splintered and proliferated, animated by warring convictions regarding man's responsibilities on earth, the prospect of endless punishment for sinners, and the possibility of salvation. By mid-century, the region was a spiritual aurora borealis, vibrating with theories, experiments, visions, and madness. Mormonism, Shakerism, perfectionism, Adventism, strict sexual abstinence, epic polygamy, communal living experiments, and great social movements charged with the volatile energies of religious fervor. Abolitionists, suffragists, fugitive slaves finding temporary refuge in cellars and barns on their way to Canada. Lone prophets on fire with idiosyncratic readings of Scripture roamed the streets and roads and fields, gathering adherents ready to follow anyone who delivered a bold certainty and a compelling narrative in stirring oratory. In communities and towns with names reaching back to antiquity, Ithaca, Homer, Seneca, Ovid, Virgil, Cato, Romulus, Hector, Brutus, Ulysses, those are all real names of towns up there, an idealized mythic past shared the imagination with a millennial future. It was the present that posed an insoluble riddle. Anyway, so that's...
Yeah. And there also was, well, I shouldn't say also, but there was a great deal of intellectual ferment there,
Yeah.
and also some intellectual pretension, and also some local boosterism,
Yes.
all of which goes into Tom's character, who's a young academic who's teaching at some kind of a collegiate institution in Auburn, hatching the plan to have a writers' conference, which of course did not exist. So he invites Herman Melville, who was still known as the author of Typee. When he died a few years later, the New York Times called him Henry Melville. Henry Melville. Yeah. Yeah, I know. Ouch. Frederick Douglass is at this conference. Harriet Beecher Stowe and her buddy from Hartford, Connecticut, Mark Twain. And then he had to, kind of honor both sides. So he invites this horrendous former Confederate general to come, and also a very popular, a made-up one, and also a made-up, very popular female novelist who was
kind of a romance novelist. So.
Yeah, kind of a romance novel. So did I miss anybody?
Say?
Did I miss anybody?
No, I think you got
Okay, yeah.
Oh, well, there was somebody...
Walt Whitman.
Oh, you didn't mention...
I didn't mention... Yeah, okay, yeah.
And then there's also...
The guy with the beard.
A surprise guest in the audience, too.
Yes, there is, who, as I recall, is never named.
Right, she's never named.
She's
right.
never named.
But it's Emily Dickinson.
It is Emily Dickinson, yeah. And she kind of, just sort of spooks around and checks things out and kind of hands Walt Whitman one of her poems, which he seems to think is good. Anyway, so that's what's happening in this place. But there's one other person I want to talk about, which gets me back to a Free State yet again, who's a banjo player named Henry. This seems to be a thing of Tom's. And Henry is an old acquaintance of Mark Twain's. Mark Twain runs into him when he's on the way to Auburn, and Twain decides to have Henry put on a show. And do you want to read that stuff, Tom, or no?
Well, I think Twain, first of all, Twain always looks to stir up the pot a little bit. He's a mischievous type figure to begin with, and he and Henry are good old pals. I mean, it's the same. It's Henry Sims who was the
And Twain was a great fan of the banjo.
Yes, on record as being
so. And there's a photo online, which I don't know if it's bogus or not, but of Twain playing a banjo. Have you seen this thing?
I have not. No,
I'm highly suspicious of it. But anyway, it's there.
Yeah. No, I mean.
So why the banjo?
Yeah, why did that happen
banjo?
In the book?
Well, not only that, but why your interest in the banjo?
Okay.
We happen to know that Tom is a pretty good banjo player.
Well, the reason I got interested in the banjo, you knew Mike Seeger.
Yes.
I know you knew some.
Yeah.
And Mike Seeger was one of the very greatest old-time folk musicians, and sort of a central figure, as you know, in the so-called folk music revival of the early 60s and late 1950s. And I got to know Mike in the late years of his life because he was just extraordinary musician. I mean, he would do very old, centuries old ballads, the kinds of things that folk musicians were doing in the very early '60s. If they wanted to be considered to be, serious folk musicians, Barbara Allen, Golden Vanity, things like that, and much more obscure old ballads that had been collected by folklorists in the mountains of Appalachia. And Mike but the thing that set Mike apart from others, in my opinion, and he had a band called the New Lost City Ramblers, which was like a seminal old-time folk music band. But Mike would reimagine the songs that he would do so that they weren't rote exercises. They didn't, a lot of times some of those musicians who played in that time could sound a little dutiful, executing the songs sort of by the book. Mike would breathe new life into them as if they were new songs. He was fantastic. Anyway, I got to know him the last 10 or 12 years of his life, and we played music together. I was extremely fortunate to be able to do that. But when he passed away, his widow, Alexia, made his instruments available to people. So I ended up with a guitar that had belonged to him, and I ended up with a banjo. But I didn't know how to play banjo. But all of a sudden I had this beautiful banjo. So I figured I had to learn how to play banjo, and I took lessons online. I didn't take lessons online. I watched banjo players play, and I tried to imitate what they were doing. And so that was it. But the thing is, in getting interested in banjo, you can't go 5 steps down the road in being interested in banjo without coming right up against the fact of slavery in America and the fact of blackface minstrelsy, which was the sort of spring in the watch of that novel, A Free State, because I got fascinated in reading about the banjo. I mean, it's an African instrument. The banjo is really, in its roots and even some of its branches, it's an African instrument. And I could explain various reasons why, but just take my word for it. It came over and, of course, went through various kinds of modifications, but it's still basically an African. So you read about the banjo and you come straight into the fact that this instrument was perfected musically in the United States by enslaved Africans. And one of the things that happened to me while I was reading about this phenomenon, this set of phenomena, was, quote unquote, slave owners would, I'm sure most of you know this, would place ads for their runaway property, quote unquote property, and offering a reward for them and, describing them in great detail. So, and I ran across this one ad, which I remember us talking about this, where a slave owner had said, they would put things, Eric, runaway, 5'8", thinks fast, talks slowly, has a scar on his left shoulder, whatever. Well, there was a description like that of this one escapee, and it had all those kinds of descriptions, and it said, very proficient on the banjar and likely to have one with him. And I remember I was so struck by that because I thought, oh my God, here's this individual who is obviously very talented, obviously strong-minded and resourceful enough to escape bondage, and yet his greatest talent is means of self-expression, and also probably means of making a living, is like this giant crosshairs on his back, a target on his back. So in a sense, his greatest strength was his greatest vulnerability. And that's a classic tragic situation or template if there ever was one. So that's what kind of got me interested in playing the banjo. But Henry makes this, is this why you're asking me about it? So Henry makes this kind of return cameo appearance in the Auburn conference. And one of the sort of sideshows of the book is that a carnival has come to town and is set up outside the town, and the different participants, Frederick Douglass, Whitman, Melville for a minute, Mark Twain, they go out and they, have a kind of idyll for a little while in between the 2 days of the conference, before things really go off the tracks, which they do. But Twain goes out and finds Henry. He knows that Henry's going to be there with this traveling carnival, and gets Henry to agree to come in and do a performance after the afternoon session on the first day, which Henry does. But Henry's a very interesting, shape-shifting kind of character. And of course, Frederick Douglass is scandalized. He's in the audience and he's trying to be polite, but he regards correctly blackface minstrelsy as being a kind of emblem of the debasement and humiliation of his race, and yet he's forced to sit there and watch this happen. And everybody else, all the white participants, are kind of enjoying it and rocking back and forth. But
Frederick Douglass really does not like his song called "The Chicken Tree."
Right, Under the Chicken
And
Tree.
if
which
you go
is an
on
actual
YouTube,
song.
you can find that song, which appears in the novel, but
It's one of the
a real
most
thing.
offensive things you could imagine hearing, and Henry does this for the audience. But Henry
After reciting a passage from Othello.
right, after reciting a passage from Othello. So he's a very ambiguous kind of figure. In any case, well, why do we bring this up?
I brought this up to drag you, perhaps not kicking and screaming, onto the subject of race in America. And, here are all these writers and cultural figures. Yes. And there's Henry, whom Mark Twain says is, the only genius he's ever met. And it's naturally making me think that the nexus of black and white in this country is, not just hugely important, but maybe even central.
Well, yeah, central would be the word. Actually, a number of people had asked me why I put that in there. I put that scene in for a couple of reasons. For one reason I have to say is that I think it makes white readers a little bit uncomfortable. And I think you should be a little bit uncomfortable when you read a book, frankly. I don't know. I mean, there are some books you read where you just want to go down a lazy river and be happy. But I wanted readers to think, what is this doing here? I don't like the fact that there's a black man doing this really kind of badly cliched performance, but Henry has the drop on everybody there, of course, and he lives by his wits. But Douglass is the sort of moral barometer or moral thermometer or whatever in the room. Yeah. So I wanted that set of contrasting interpretations of just what was going on there on stage when Henry was performing to be foregrounded, so and well-intentioned and smart and important white participants are there kind of enjoying it. And Frederick Douglass is going, if I may say, this shit again, Yeah.
I mean, that seems to be a pattern in the book, that all these people are substantially in disagreement with each other about very important things. And each of them has a point. Even, I have to say, the general, who, of course, is horrible and wrong, but he does have a point. Even the pop romance novelist mounts a very, here are all these heavy hitters. Here's Melville, and here's Whitman, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she gives a very good defense of the use of the domestic and the personal in fiction. You can't really write any of these people off.
Right.
They each are, and no wonder, not to give the ending away, but no wonder things absolutely fall apart at the end.
Right. Well, if you could write them off, why would you put them in the book?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And honestly, if I can, sort of take off from that for a second, I mean, the point of having all these notions of what all this means in radical tension with each other, seemed to me to make the book into what I hope it would be, which is a kind of microcosm of America, which is the great question of e pluribus unum. How do you get all this multiplicity, all this radical multiplicity under the same rubric? How the hell can you have, I think I did a cadenza on this in an essay once about Bob Dylan. I mean, it's all, John Wayne and John Wayne Gacy, both, classic American figures. You Frank Sinatra, Bob Dylan, Neil Armstrong and the Unabomber. They're all kind of representative that are recognizably people who have made use of the peculiar forms of possibility that this social organization offers at its best, but making such different choices and from such different backgrounds and with such different, proclivities. So that's what I wanted in this book, and that's, was part of the principle of selection of who's in the book, Yeah. I mean, just as one example, the opening panel of the conference on the first morning is Walt Whitman and Herman Melville. And I don't think you could really imagine two different visions of America, two more different visions of America. I mean, Whitman has that terrific, expansive, inclusive, booming, manifest destiny, right, of just expansion, including everything and this great set of possibilities, and it's a new world, and it's a new man, and it's a new woman, and everything's in there, the Kentucky longboat man, and the theater habitué of the Bowery, and the gold rush person, and the yada, 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 and so it's this glorious vision, which takes off really from Ralph Waldo Emerson.
I was going to say, you lucked out in not having to do Emerson since he was dead by the time this thing happened.
There would have been a lot of repetition in a sense there, I mean, I thought Emerson functioned better as a kind of gray eminence,
and you lucked out with Noah Hawthorne, too.
Well, yeah, but Hawthorne died, I think, considerably before that.
Considerably before.
Yeah.
Who did you leave out that you might have wanted in there?
Who did I leave out who I might have wanted in there? There were a lot of people I thought about putting in who I didn't include. Henry James could have been included, just chronologically, but he was really more at the start, at the sort of foothills, maybe a little bit beyond just the foothills of his career at that time. And plus, I don't like Henry James. Hate to say it.
You've got one amen here.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought you were a Henry James fan.
No.
Okay.
No,
all right.
Yeah.
I mean, what you have to acknowledge the man's extraordinary, dexterity with subordinate clauses. But I don't know. I just can't get with it particularly. But he might have been able to be there. But really, he belonged to a next set of questions in a sense, and William Dean Howells, I don't know. I just kind of couldn't. These were the people. First of all, these people, the generation that they were from, they were young when the nation was really, really young. So they came up through seeing all the possibilities and through also feeling very keenly the pressure of this very central fact of slavery and how's this going to play out? This can't be, and then this war being fought to sort of settle that question, great possibilities opening up with the advent of Reconstruction in the South, black legislators for the first time, et cetera, and then the violent and brutal suppression of Reconstruction. And so by the end of the 1870s, African Americans in the South were basically being returned to a station that was all but slavery again, and only different in name only, really. And the Jim Crow laws that were passed and the rise of lynching. So they saw that. And so I guess I picked 1883 because it could have been 1882, it could have been 1884, but it was the country was enjoying tremendous prosperity with railroads and all kinds of new technologies, but it sort of lost its way. The North, after all this talk about freedom for enslaved Africans, and that once Reconstruction was dismantled, they kind of went, yeah, that's too bad. Let's get on with things. And it was a terrible fork in the road that was taken. We're paying for it to this day. Yeah.
I think the character that I like the most in this book is Harriet Beecher Stowe, whom I can't read, but she's an old pro at this point. Yeah, she published Uncle Tom's Cabin many years ago. She's sick of it. She's sick of being famous. She's sick of the whole thing. Twain seems to drag her along on this thing.
Well, they lived next to each other.
They lived next to each other in Hartford. But talk a little bit about how you arrived at that view of her. Why did you make her sort of the give me a break person?
As you know, I mean, a lot of times when you're writing a book, some of the choices you make are just in pure intuition. I don't know. And Harriet Stowe, I probably knew least about. I mean, I've read tons about all of these writers, not just biographical material, but obviously the canonical works, and correspondence, letters. Boy, oh boy, letters were incredibly useful in this project. Journals, all of that. But Stowe, there was less information available. So I knew a couple little things, and sometimes all you need is like a piton to screw in the rock here and one over here, and you can sort of start climbing on it. And with her, I knew a couple things. For one thing, she wrote this book. And by the way, Uncle Tom's Cabin is a better book than people remember it being. It's not a great book, but it's not what people sort of dismiss it as being usually. And if you read any 5 or 6 or 7 pages out of Uncle Tom's Cabin, you can see that this was not a pious, tedious preacher, or scold or something like that. There's a kind of a salty undercurrent to the prose that was telling me something. And then I read someplace, and I can't remember where I read this. Mary, do you remember where I read this? Wherever you are. That she used to, particularly in her later years, she liked to hide behind shrubbery and like jump out at people, and startle them. And I thought, well, hey, Harriet, I like you, Harriet. So there was that. And then there was also just the fact that she had published this extraordinary, she had had this extraordinary effect on the society and on the course of things in the mid-19th century. Abraham Lincoln apparently greeted her, the story is, by calling her, so this is the little lady who started this big war. So she had that moment, and then she kept producing these books that they sold because she was Harriet Beecher Stowe, and so she was a name brand in effect. But so I figured you put all that together, and you had to figure she was kind of like unimpressed in a lot of ways by a lot of things. And she is funny, and she obviously doesn't suffer fools gladly. She doesn't even suffer regular people gladly. She just kind of, and she's, I love the character too. I could read something from her at some point, I suppose, if you wanted an illustration. But that's the best I could say, is that really sometimes you just go by feel. I mean, Melville I've read so much about, and Whitman, most of them. But Stowe I just went by feel, and she just seemed to be the right flavor to have in there. Plus she just she listens to Lucy Comstock, who's this made-up romance writer, who's one of the smartest people on the whole program, because she's absolutely practical. She's has under no illusions about the significance of her own work, and she's just a badass in her way. She's peddling these romance novels about women in desperate search of a husband. Preferably one with rippling pectorals. But in the practical terms of her life, she's really kind of a proto-feminist. I mean, she's absolutely financially independent. She doesn't need anybody else. She's tough.
Not to give anything away, but she does put the moves on the Confederate general.
Well, yeah, actually, that's probably a fair way of. I think she was kind of, yeah. I wouldn't be surprised.
Do you find me attractive?
Yeah, well, that's.
If you do, are you going to act upon it?
Well,
This is not putting the moves?
Well, but that's partly what she's writing in the book, and it's all right. So what David's talking about. At the end of the book, there's a kind of epilogue type of section where everybody is kind of on their way home after attending this. And everybody's going home with a sort of different door prize. Mark Twain, after several years of not working on Huckleberry Finn and laying it aside, has just, by seeing Henry and Frederick Douglass at work, has just realized how he can finish writing Huckleberry Finn. And Herman Melville, who's basically having an anxiety attack and a sort of mild nervous breakdown in his room after coming back from not quite going to this carnival that's outside of town, he goes up to his room and he's writing, he takes notes, and he starts writing Billy Budd. And so she's got a novel that she has started. She's written, God only knows, probably 40 books, right? And she starts a novel at the end of the book called The General's Lady. And so there's a section in the book where her prose from the novel is intercut with, sort of third-person resume of what was actually happening. And yes, she invites General Forrest Taylor to her room at the Owasco Hotel, and he kind of demurs because his wife is ill at home, and she's pissed off, and she basically takes a drink out of his hand and says, "Get the hell out of here." And that's one of the reasons I love her. But anyway, so. Yeah.
Tom, are you going to read more to us?
What's that?
Are you going to read more to us?
Read?
Read more.
I'll read more. Sure. You want me to read? Should I read something?
Yeah.
All right. Let me do that, because at least that way it'll give you a little bit of the flavor of how some of these characters sound and how the book works. And I was trying to, actually, I thought you might ask me to do that. One of the things about this book is hard to read from because there's so many different textures in the book and so many different kinds of moments. But what I thought I'd do is I think I'll read maybe 3 sections from an early chapter in which all these different writers are gathering in Auburn, okay? So, and that'll give you a sense of the different sounds attached to these writers and a little bit of sense of how the book begins, okay? If I talk like this, can you hear me? Yeah. Not really? Yeah. No, okay. Wait, if you couldn't hear me, how come you shouldn't hear me?
He's a tricky son of a gun.
Okay. All right, this is chapter 3. So I should say before now, you've been introduced to Frederick Olmsted Matthews, who's this very idealistic young junior professor at this collegiate institute. And he tells the story of why he wants to do this and how he kind of inveigles the administration into letting him do it. And then the second chapter is told in a different voice, the voice of a reporter who's living in Auburn, New York, and just chafing and being in this, what he regards as a backwater. He wants to go to New York and write for a big-time newspaper, particularly Pulitzer's revamped New York World, which was a very sensationalistic, was being turned into a very sensationalistic newspaper at that time. So he takes it upon himself to kind of stir the pot with different people who might be interested, different people, townspeople, people in the surrounding areas who might be interested in attending and taking sides in the arguments that were sure to ensue. Okay, so chapter 2 belongs to him. This is chapter 3. At 12 minutes past 4 on the afternoon of Thursday, June 14th, 1883, a man in late middle age, with a full, well-trimmed beard and intelligent eyes that seemed to regard everything across a great distance, stepped down from the train at Auburn, foregoing the conductor's proffered assistance. One small valise followed him, carried by a porter whom he tipped generously. Once clear of other descending passengers, he stood looking up at the cloudless late spring skies and the trees, absent-mindedly fingering the large copper 1-cent piece given him by his grandfather, which he carried in his left trouser pocket, along with a small and well-worn length of whalebone. It had been a while since Herman Melville had made a landing alone in an unfamiliar city. He had not yet firmly decided to attend that evening's gathering, an embarkation party for the weekend's event. Such gatherings had become uncomfortable for him. In recent years, he had tentatively accepted and then withdrawn from more than one such invitation. His early successes, nearly 40 years in the past, and based on his first-person accounts of travels in the South Seas, he thought of now with ambivalence. He considered them minor works and chafed under the lingering general view that he was no more than a weaver of such romances. The public remembered him, if they remembered him at all, as the barefoot narrator of Typee, likely lost by now to the cannibals, since the indifferent reception afforded Moby Dick, the book he considered his finest achievement, and the scorn heaped upon 2 subsequent novels. He had withdrawn from a literary world that seemed to lack any further use for his talents. A deepening pessimism about human possibility had rested heavily upon his spirits in these later years, and at intervals his family and closest friends had even feared for his sanity. He worked long, tedious days at the Custom House in New York City, conducting dreary rounds and compiling lists. When a letter arrived inviting him to participate in a symposium of writers, he was deeply unsettled and had initially rejected the idea. But the prospect of such a gathering, after so long a period of isolation, stimulated anticipation along with reflexive anxiety. He had decided, finally, with lingering misgivings, to accept the invitation. 5 minutes after quitting the train, he found himself seated in a carriage across from a man perhaps 10 years his junior, quite handsome, and dressed in an elegant jacket and shined boots. Melville asked the man if he were participating in the conference. "I am," the man replied. "I imagine you are as well?" Melville noticed a 3-inch scar below and to the rear of his left ear. Melville replied in the affirmative, and they introduced themselves. The man's name was Forrest Taylor. "Melville, the author of Typee?" Forrest Taylor asked. Melville noted the appraising aspect of the man's expression, the eyes a mixture of irony and arrogance above a thin, unkind smile. "Yes," Melville said. He apologized to Taylor for being unfamiliar with his work and asked what he had written. "A personal memoir of the War of the Secession," Taylor replied. "I was a general of the Confederacy." After a pause apparently designed to measure the effect of this information on Melville, he added, "I was rather surprised the invitation was extended." "I was surprised as well," Melville said. About my own invitation, I mean." "How so?" Taylor said. "I doubted that anyone remembered my books," Melville said. "Most have been out of print for years." "Then we're Lodge brothers," Taylor said, evidently pleased. "Relics of past glories." The remark and the satisfied smile that accompanied it contained a quality of implied complicity that made Melville uneasy, and he was relieved when the carriage entered the gates of the Auburn Collegiate Institute. There's a line space. Having been aided up the stairs at Harmony House by one of the students, a boy named Lemuel, to whom he gave a $50 in gratitude, Walt Whitman lay back on the bed pillows and closed his eyes. The windows were open, and a slight breeze carried the scent of mown grass into him. June was an empire of fair promise. Old age is the time of ebbing. Memories, powers of reason, fluids, ambitions. He had wished to contain all, but soon he knew all would contain him. Reaching for his jacket, which he had thrown on top of his bag on the floor near the bed, he retrieved a small notebook from the inside pocket and wrote down this thought, then set the notebook and pencil on the nightstand. His doctor had advised against any lengthy excursion, yet the prospect of speaking at a college was enticing, as if he had been offered a temporary visa back to the land of youth. And he had come, a long and unpleasant trip from Camden. The college, he had been told, was out of session now. He wished he could have heard the shouts of the boys at play, seen them hurrying with their books to class, golden-haired or brown-haired or black-haired, tanned by the sun and strong in their youth, happy on the playing field and happy also in the dining hall, calling out in names of friendship, jesting, contending in games of skill. He was hungry. Was it ever enough? No, and may it never be enough. How much beauty there was, and how fleeting. The word freedom had caught him in the invitation letter. Its meaning had begun to turn in the preceding few years, taken on a sinister drift. Sinister meaning left-handed, of course, just as influence was the pouring into, and prophecy the bubbling forth. Words were wings. They lifted you. At the same time, they sent their roots deep into the loam of the human mind and tethered you. He was growing agitated. Supercilious was a raised eyebrow. Prurience, an intolerable itch. He closed his eyes again and resolved to quiet himself and rest in advance of that evening's gathering. Now, if I have time, I'm going to read one part of Mark Twain, and then I know we're right up against it. This will take about a minute.
So up against it, but I think we want
May
to
I
hear
do
Mark
this?
Twain.
May I do one more? Can I do Twain?
We've kind of neglected
take
Mark
that as a-
Twain in this.
Huh?
We've kind of neglected Mark Twain, and he's obviously the star.
So, well, obviously.
He's obviously the star.
Well, he's the star of, in the people's opinion of, well, so here's Mark Twain. Mark Twain fished a cigar out of his inside left breast pocket as the countryside west of Hartford opened out and the river flickered behind the fine elm trees. He found the trimmer in his other pocket. His presence had caused a fuss at the station, small crowds turning toward him like schools of fish. He dispensed a few words which he forgot immediately. Mrs. Stowe, his traveling companion, stood to one side, annoyed and somewhat envious. He joked her out of it as they boarded. He had given an autograph to the conductor. They look at you and you look at them. The you who looks at them is not the you they see when they look at you. Iron law of life right there. Mr. Clemens behind the window in the back office, keeping the accounts for his front man. He was used to being the most famous person in the room. Was this why he struck the nostalgic note so often? Back when the exchange was straightforward and they liked you or didn't like you because they liked you or didn't like you? Much more like regular billiards. 3 balls on the table, the pure geometry, flawed comparison. You can't blame the other balls for getting in the way. Dozing and rocking. Sunlight stuttering in the window from between the majestic elms. That river that pressed on him from inside. What had been freedom at a certain age became necessity later on. Another iron law, rusting with the years. When he awoke, they were near Watertown. His watch said 5:37. Sky still light, nearing the apogee of spring's upswing. They had dinner brought to their car while the train took on water and the other necessities. How was it possible that for every $1 he made, he got $5 further into debt? A medicine show barker selling his own daydreams. Any fort became a jail eventually, even your own face. Anyway, that's 3 of them. Okay.
We're wondering if anybody out there has questions that they want to ask.
Questions, that was. See, they just want to hear reading. That's it. They just want
That's
to...
probably, yeah.
No, seriously, anybody have any questions about that? You do, yes.
Please wait for a microphone so the live stream viewers can hear you.
What's that? Oh, we have a microphone.
Yeah.
Okay.
Who had the question? So I wasn't sure you had made this up. When I saw the title, I thought, oh, maybe there was such
An actual
there was Seneca Falls.
historical event.
There was, I was like strange because I went to school out near there. I'd never heard of it before. And then I saw you writing in their voices, they're writing in their diaries. And I'm thinking, is he... So I had to skip to the back of the book in order to see like if there were credits for what you were, what quoting, right? And so I marvel at your ability to to adopt their voices, and I wonder how you got there.
How I did that?
How did you get there? How were you able to do
How did
that?
I do it?
Yeah,
Pure genius, wasn't it, Tom?
it's pretty
What was
hard.
that?
Wasn't it just pure genius?
I'm going to let that ball go off the table. How do I do it? Well, for one thing, I guess, it's fair to say that I'm a musician, partly. So I'm guided by my ear a lot of the time. And I think maybe I have a peculiarity of habit when I read, which is I get my sense of of what's happening in a scene or in a character by the actual prose that they are emitting, whether it's spoken or written. So in other words, what they choose to emphasize by the rhythms of the sentence, by where the accent falls, with the word that the sentence ends on, is it short, is it fast? That's a cue, as it is in music, to the emotional valence of what's going on with those materials. So, I guess, when I listen to jazz, I memorize Charlie Parker solos. I memorize, Fats Navarro solos, Jackie McLean solos, and they all sound different, but they all have I'm going to not say DNA because it's become almost as common and hackneyed a word to use as iconic, but they all have a fingerprint that's automatically stamps them as them, and so does the sound of what a writer's doing. Brands them in a way. And so I guess I just found myself looking out from inside each of those characters as I read them in a funny kind of way. And I just found that I was able to speak in their voices. Or that's, maybe anyone who reads the book is free to disagree. But that was the sense that I had. I never felt doubt about doing it. I felt that I knew these beings. Yeah, but thank you for asking me that. By the way, as far as whether the thing actually happened, one editor who passed on the book said, but I will tell you, I learned a tremendous amount from this. I did not know this happened. This was absolutely fantastic. Thank you. He did me a favor, I was able to walk past happily. Who else? Yeah.
Did you have the ending in mind when you started writing? And was the ending that you wound up with when you were finished the ending that you had in mind, if indeed you did have an ending in mind?
No, I didn't. I didn't. Well, it's that's kind of hard to remember. I think certainly by a certain point, I knew that. Well, I knew that the actual conference itself was going to end in tears. I mean, I knew that. But of course, I've been listening to the news the last few years. It didn't take a whole lot of imagination to sort of figure that was going to happen. But when the different characters go their way, they each take something different. They're not necessarily weeping as they leave either. But what the conference portends is a perhaps insoluble riddle, right? So I knew that it was going to be something like that. It was going to land somewhere over there. But did I know what was actually going to happen and how? No. And I don't want to know that. I mean, you always, I think, pretty much, well, you could speak to this too, but I mean, I think you almost always have some kind of hypothesis about what's going to happen. But, the hypothesis has to stay hypothetical. You really, if you're too sure of what's going to happen, you end up, painting by numbers. And you end up being a kind of unpleasant character in relationship to your characters. In other words, you're telling them what they're going to be doing after a certain point. They may have different ideas. That sounds like literary BS, but it's not. A character has to have a life, an inner life. And if it has life, it's going to have some degree of surprise or freedom of action. So I had some sense of where the book was probably going to be going. And then as the book goes on, certain things are laid out that make certain possibilities sort of implausible and other possibilities more necessary, you see. So, maybe by 2/3 of the way through the book or 3/4 of the way through, I had some sense of what was going to happen and how. But rarely do I begin a book. I mean, do you?
No.
Right? No, you don't really. Why would, as John Prine once said to me, if you knew how it was going to end, why would you write it? How about anybody else? I like questions. This is fun. Even though I like questions, you're not going to give them to me? What kind of people are you? I mean, come on. Just kidding. Should I read something else? Is that would you prefer that? No? Okay, you don't even want me to read something. Yes, you have a question. Oh, I thought you were raising your hand. Yeah, you were raising your hand. Okay.
What was, for you, the biggest surprise
The biggest surprise?
as you moved along through the book?
That's a great question. What was the biggest surprise? Everything kind of surprised me. It's hard to pick a moment. There was not a moment. I think the carnival coming was well, no, that's not true. I'll tell you exactly. In fact, I can tell you exactly what the biggest surprise was. The coming of a group of very militant women suffragists to the conference, because they surprise the organizer, who's a callow youth after all. And he has planned all these great writers, Whitman, Twain, blah, blah, blah. But the one thing that he overlooked was the fact that women didn't have the right to vote or do much of anything else at that time, right? And he's completely forgotten about this. But the reporter who I mentioned before is going around stirring pots. Well, he goes to Seneca Falls, where that great women's rights convention was held, and he finds a group of women who are in a meeting, and he tells them that this is going to happen and that nobody has, put suffrage on the menu for this gathering. So they show up and they read the riot act to the organizer. But now I'm going to make a self-damaging admission here, but that partly came out because I realized at a certain point that I had sort of sketched in who was going to be there, but I hadn't figured on having representatives of women's suffrage there. So when they arrive, they arrive with the top spin of my own kicking myself for not having anticipated this, So it ended up being a really happy surprise, because when the conference finally goes all to pieces, everything's going in all these different directions, and they are a marvelously militant force saying, you're talking all this stuff about the future of literature, you're talking all this stuff about America, and yeah, you're talking about slavery, but okay, the Negro, as it was said then, has the vote. What about women? And Frederick Douglass and the leader of this little group get into it a little bit, because there was a lot of tension actually between Frederick Douglass and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony over who should take precedence in getting voting rights. So everybody in the book has their different version of what should be happening and what is happening, and their coming into the picture was probably the biggest surprise. I'm glad you asked that question. That's right. And it took to this point in our presentation to get to that very important point of the book. So there you go. That was the biggest surprise for me in writing it. I was glad it happened too.
All right, we'll take one more question.
One more question, somebody. And there we are.
Oh, hey. I was wondering if you could pick a song, like a theme song for your book, would you pick a classic folk song from that time period, or would you want it to be a new tune?
If I say it again,
If you could pick a song that represents the book to you, would it be a classic old tune, like an old banjo tune, or would you want a new modern song with modern arrangements?
What an interesting question. Honestly, I think if I were going to pick one song, I would probably, honestly, I don't know that I could pick one, old folk tune to represent it. I don't know that I could pick one new pop tune, but I would probably try to figure out a song by Bob Dylan, maybe something like Idiot Wind. Because actually, I think, people sometimes say, well, who would populate an Auburn conference today? And the only answer I can really come up with is I think Bob Dylan was really like a one-man Auburn conference. There's so many parts to his creative life and to his career. So, you know, I think it would probably have to be something by Dylan, because Dylan does, and by his own avowal, contain multitudes. So probably something by Bob. I think that would be the best answer I could give. Thanks for that question. It's a great question. And thank you, everybody, for coming and spending this time with us. And I'm happy to sign your books, if you have books. And how about a hand for David Gates? I'm so happy David was here to do this. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you both. That was great. And if you want to get the books, they're over at the bookstore counter. So just head on over there and then come back in here and we'll all hang out.